This is our first lecture for Wednesday, April 1st. And we're continuing on looking at different marine ecosystems. We looked at a number of marine ecosystems that are close to shore, that experience tidal fluctuations. Those were intertidal ecosystems. Now we're moving on a little farther offshore. These are underwater all the time, still relatively shallow water, and heavily influenced by land or the continents. And this topic for today is the continental shelf ecosystems. So in terms of this ecosystem, we're going to look at 5 different things. Humans obviously have a lot of interaction with continental shelves. There are millions and millions and millions of people that live along the shoreline. And the water that's out there, there's a lot of these intertidal ecosystems that we looked at earlier. But easy access, close proximity to the continental shelves. Some places the continental shelves are pretty broad, a lot of area. Other places they're a lot narrower. And so there's a lot of human interaction. And so we'll look at some of the characteristics, what kind of environmental features there are, and then look in the water column after we look at the bottom. So the conditions that you find out there, a lot of sunlight, it's shallow, so there's a lot of water that experiences light. And you don't get to depths where there's no light in much of the water. There's a lot of different consumers. There's a lot of different primary producers. There's zooplankton that are feeding on phytoplankton. There's some algae there. If you get close to shore, there's flowering plants, but you tend to have this transition from flowering plants to algae and phytoplankton as the primary producers. And as far as humans go, we've been taking advantage of food that was produced in continental shelf waters for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And as soon as we started making boats and venturing offshore a little, then this interaction was even greater. And so for a long time, there's been shellfish and finfish that have been utilized from continental shelf waters, and it's still really, really productive. So each country values their continental shelf waters to the degree where there's these exclusive economic zones that have been established for all these different countries. It's basically water that belongs to a country. Extends 200 miles out from shore. And here's the United States EEZ. Got a lot of EEZ out in the Pacific around these islands, only one of which is a state, Hawaii. But these other islands that have different status with the United States, territories or protectorates. And then in the Atlantic, of course, we've got the east coast of the U.S. Gulf, and then the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. So the United States has quite a bit of water that's in the continental shelf that would be included in the continental shelf. And just looking at this map, you can see the extent on the east coast and where we are, where our university is. I don't know where you are now, in Rhode Island. Now back early, one of probably the first week of this class, back when we were meeting in person, we looked at the ocean floor. We looked at geological features of the ocean, and we saw that there's this extension of the continents, basically, that extends out from the continents. When the sea level comes up, then there's less of the continent, and there's more water that's covering the continent. When sea level goes down, there's more land, and the shape of the continents changes somewhat. And so basically, over geological time, or the historical time of the Earth, the sea level change results in different levels of the continental shelf as well. But if you extend out from the continents, there's a gentle slope. That's why it's called the shelf. It doesn't increase in depth that much. So you go out some places like on the U.S. East Coast, 100 miles offshore some places, and it's only 150 feet deep. And above this this shelf is continental shelf waters. Other places on the west coast of the U.S., it might be 10 miles. You go out, and then there's the steep drop off. So the continental shelf that surrounds a continent is different lengths, different widths, and in an average might be 440 miles, but there's some that are very narrow, there's some that are very wide. And there's this gradual increase, a couple hundred feet when you're out at the edge of the shelf, and then you reach this point where it drops off very quickly, the continental slope, and where it gets into deep water very quickly. And this is part of the continent, really. It's attached to the continent. The rocks and the sediment, the part of the Earth's crust underneath this water, is associated with the continent. It's part of the continent. And when you move out to the edge of the continental slope, then you move into areas where the bottom and the geological features are ocean associated rather than continent associated. A lot of input of fresh water, a lot of input of nutrients, a lot of upwelling that takes place. So if this is shallow water, for one, a lot of sunlight. If there's a lot of nutrients, for two, and there's commonly upwelling, for three, then as you can imagine, this is a very, very productive place. And we'll see, get an idea of how productive this is. The huge amount of food that's produced and consumed by humans, not produced by humans, but consumed by humans. So what kind of features are there in continental shelf waters? One of the things to keep in mind is that after this, we're going to look at coral reefs, but after which you could consider a relatively shallow marine ecosystem. But then we're going to move out in the open ocean, and the water in the open ocean, the physical features of that water, like the physical oceanography, the currents, and the way that the water moves, the chemical properties of seawater in the open ocean, those are different than water that's over the continental shelf. Now, there's no boundary, there's no border that says you're leaving the continental shelf waters and you're moving into the open ocean. But there's a difference in the water, and that difference is translated into the biology. You find different types of organisms that are there. So first, we're going to concentrate on the environmental features that are dominant in continental shelf waters. In a little while, next week, when we talk about the open ocean, you have to think back to what the properties of seawater, movement of water, and how that translates into the organisms that you find in continental shelf waters versus the open ocean. So to begin with, let's look at waves, movement of water. Continental shelf waters, movement of water is an important determinant in terms of what's found there and their lifestyle, how they feed and how they disperse. So first of all, there's waves. We saw this in the rocky intertidal, but in continental shelf waters, waves are pretty common. Out in the open ocean, not so much. There's big waves with a long period, a long distance between the peak and the trough, or the peaks of waves. And so in the continental shelf waters, there's waves that move, and Water moves a long ways and it starts piling up as it gets closer to the continent. And so these waves are responsible for moving a lot of water. They affect organisms, especially in terms of their ability to remain in place on the bottom, down to pretty deep depths. Can be affected by waves. So right along the edge of the shoreline, of course, waves are going to be a big factor in determining who's there, who can attach to the rocks. But even deeper and farther offshore, waves have an influence on the organisms, especially in terms of the organisms that are there. They have to be able to remain in place, and in altering the sediments that are there, how fine the sediments are, or how coarse they are, which is going to influence who's found on the bottom and who's burrowing into the bottom. And one of the things that waves have a big influence on is the body size of organisms. You find a bunch of small organisms on the bottom in continental shelf waters that are influenced by waves. Another prominent feature of continental shelf waters is that they're influenced by currents. There's strong currents that move through continental shelf waters. It's another feature that organisms have to deal with. Sometimes the movement of water isn't caused by waves, but it's caused by these strong currents, and it disturbs the sediments, it moves the sediments, it transports the sediments, and again influences the type of sediment you find on the bottom. Is it rough, coarse sediment, or is it fine, silty type of sediment? That's really going to influence the organisms that you find there, and it's going to influence the diversity of organisms that you find there, how diverse the community is. So both of these have some disadvantages in terms of carrying off sediment and making it less hospitable for a lot of benthic organisms. They have some advantages in use for dispersal. If you're creating all these larvae, which is how a huge number of marine invertebrates and fish reproduce, and they're dependent on the movement of water for dispersal. Their fertilized eggs moving long distances, much longer than they would ever be able to move themselves, then those are important things. So, this movement of water, it delivers food, delivers oxygen, it's used for dispersal. Those are all advantages. But there's some disadvantages as well that you have to deal with water movement. Well, what about light? Now, we're going to, again, get out in the open ocean and see that there's a little sliver of water at the surface that gets light, and below that, everything else is dark. A huge portion of the ocean is dark, dark, dark. No photosynthesis, no input of energy from photosynthesis. So in terms of light on the continental shelves, there's a huge portion of the continental shelf that light penetrates all the way down to the bottom. But there's other places where the turbidity, the depth gets to be a certain level, and you have very little light. When we were looking at primary production in the ocean, we saw, if you remember back then, we saw that light attenuates pretty quickly, and you don't have to go very deep. Just a matter of 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters, which is certainly within the limit of the depth of the continental shelves, before you have a huge decline in the amount of light and the wavelengths of light that are penetrating the water. So there's different levels of turbidity, there's different depths, continental shelf waters, but for the most part, light reaches fairly deep depths. One of the reasons why continental shelf waters are so productive. And you've got variables that influence the turbidity, that influence how deep light penetrates. Some places very clear along the continental shelves, and other places a lot more turbid. And in terms of the sediments, now the sediments are really the theme of this continental shelf ecosystems. So sediments are influenced by currents, they're influenced by waves. There's going to be different types of sediments depending on how much wave action there is and depending on how much current strength there is. There's also going to be different sediments depending on how much light there is above. If you think about it, the amount of light and the amount of photosynthesis that's going on above is going to influence how much productivity. All these things that are photosynthesizing, they only live for a certain amount of time. They get eaten by little zooplankton, by little fish and squid. All those things are going to die, or they're going to get eaten, and the wastes from the organisms that ate them, it's going to sink down to the bottom. So it may be an interesting thing to think about, but the amount of light in the water above the sediments is going to influence the composition of the sediments, because it's influencing who's up there, who's dying, and who's sinking down to the bottom to form the sediments in the first place. So we'll look at this movement of water influencing the sediments. We'll look at the primary productivity above. And the sediments are really a big determinant of who you find on the bottom. So to begin with, we're going to look at who's on the bottom. What kind of organisms occupy the bottom of these continental shelf waters? They're very productive. There's a lot of fishing that goes on for crabs and for lobster and for scallops, things like that. So there's a lot of productivity. There's a lot of habitat that is very productive and very suitable for things that we want to fish for and that we want to eat, like those invertebrates that I mentioned. So if you take a minute and look at this, the influence of weak currents versus strong currents, the current strength is going to influence what the sediments are like, which is going to influence who's in the sediments. Fine sediments are a lot easier to burrow in. It's easier to hold your place there and not be moved by the water current, and to have some protection from the movement of water when you're in your burrow. And if you can contrast that with coarse sediments that are moving a lot, and it's not as easy to dig into the sediments, you're going to have very different type of organisms. And basically, you've got a bunch of organisms that live on the bottom. We saw the same thing in estuaries, but there's organisms that live on the bottom, and epifauna, and there's organisms that are buried in the sediments, infauna. And so there's a lot of burrowers and there's a lot of epifauna that you find on the ocean bottom. So if you look around the continental shelf and look at the sediment type that you find there, most of it is soft. There's some places where there's hard sediment. There's rocks, or there's mollusks that have created reefs that are hard structures. Some places where the sediment doesn't settle that much because of strong currents. There's some places where there's relatively large areas of hard substrate. But for the most part, this hard substrate, like rocks, are patchily distributed. There's a rock here and rock there and other rocks. So most of the bottom of the continental shelf is soft. It's sediment that of different sizes and different types. But there's a lot of opportunities for burrowing organisms in continental shelf waters. And you find a lot of organisms that are burrowing. And so there's a bit of a three-dimensional habitat that extends down a little ways. Sometimes this layer of sediment is fairly deep. And so you have organisms that burrow down a couple of meters into the sediment. Other places, the sediment's a lot thinner, depending on water movement, depending on the amount of light, primary productivity above. But still, a lot of places you have things that crawl along the bottom, like crustaceans and some mollusks. And you've got other things that are big burrowers, like a lot of bivalve mollusks, a lot of worms, and some of a number of the different types of invertebrates that we looked at. And then on the bottom, you've got these things crawling around. They're not burrowers, but they're the epifauna. And then in the water column, above the sediments, you've got fish that are not up in the water column very far, but they're very benthic oriented, or they're demersal. Demersal refers to them being in the water column associated with the bottom. There's also benthic fish that are actually lay on the bottom, things like flounders and things that are very associated with the bottom. Okay, so if you go around, especially the United States, continental shelves, but also continental shelves around the world, you'd find some typical types of communities that are associated with a particular type of bottom, and in some cases a particular type of primary producers. So we're going to look at these 4 different types of benthic communities that are common in continental shelf waters and see what the conditions are, what kind of primary productivity there is there, and what kind of organisms you find there in the sediments, on the sediments, and in the water above in these communities. They're made up of different types of organisms, invertebrates that we looked at, and vertebrates that we looked at, especially fish, but also mammals, and in some cases reptiles. So we'll do that in this second lecture for Wednesday, April 1st.